My name's Michelle Briggs. I'm the Clinical Professor of Nursing and I am the Capacity Building Theme Lead for NIHR ARC-GM. And I'm talking today with Professor Alys Young from the University of Manchester. And I'm going to be asking you a few questions, and you've kindly agreed to talk to me about your career and your experience in research. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, how did you get to be a professor of social work?
So I did my first degree in English, and at the end of that I realised that that obviously wasn't my career pathway, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I'd always had an interest in mental health, largely for personal reasons as much as professional reasons. And so following my first degree, I decided to figure out what this thing called social work and mental health might be about, because I had really no idea what it was. So I worked for a year as a residential care assistant in what was called in those days a therapeutic community for people living with schizophrenia, and I lived there for a year. As part of the community and also working there. That really helped me understand I absolutely wanted to be a social worker, largely because I felt that whilst I might be doing a decent job in kind of everyday relations and interactions with the people I was living with, I actually had no power. I had no power to support people, to make changes in their lives. And that's, for me, it's quite an important point, because one of the things about social work that distinguishes it from social care is that social work is a statutory profession in which those of us who are qualified registered social workers are given very specific powers under laws, whether that's to do with children and families or whether it's to do with adults or particular crisis situations, to actually make choices, sometimes on behalf of an individual, sometimes with an individual. But we actually have a legal power, duty, and responsibility to do so. And for me, moving from the position I was in to wanting to train as a social worker was essentially about moving up to be a registered, qualified professional who had been trained to work under those powers, duties, and responsibilities. So I went off and did my qualification, which I did at master's level. So you can qualify at undergraduate level or at master's level. And you do an academic course and you receive a specific certification of qualification in social work, which over the years has changed its name, but nonetheless is a specific one. And that then gives you the right to apply for registration with, under our professional body. So you have to be both a qualified social worker and registered, but both are required in order to practice. So I did that, and I did that for a number of years and absolutely loved it. And I worked in children and families in child protection. I did some additional training to work in mental health in what these days is called AMPs, so advanced mental health practitioners, or sorry, advanced mental health professionals, but in my day was called ASWs, approved social workers. And I also have a specialism in working in sign language with deaf people. So I also worked in the deaf community as a social worker. And I loved it, had no time to myself, was constantly learning and intellectually a bit bored. And that's what eventually took me down the sort of research pathway. Mm-hmm. I had no intention of ever becoming a researcher, no intention of being an academic. I wanted to carry on being a social worker, but I sort of turned up at a university department. I mean, I don't know how I quite had the audacity to do it looking back, but I turned up at a university department with a named professor I'd found and walked into his office and asked whether he needed any volunteer help from a social worker for the work that he was doing. And he had the good grace to give me some time, and we talked, and at the end of it he said, no, you really need to go off and do a PhD. I had no idea what a PhD was, and at that time there was no clear pathway for social workers to move between a professional role into a research role or back again, or to do it alongside each other. you basically had to give up being a social worker in order to get your research qualification, or to do it part-time. And any practicing social worker will tell you doing a part-time research degree is not easy. But anyway, so I did my PhD, which was in relation to parents with deaf children, and I had every intention of going back to practice, but I kind of got hooked. I got hooked on the research. And so I went back into practice for about 9 months, helping set up a family centre down in the southwest of England. And then I had an idea for a project, and I was fortunate enough to get funding for it. And so I did another research project, and then I went into teaching social work at university. Knew that teaching, whilst I enjoyed it, wasn't actually everything I wanted to do. So I applied for more research money with the support of people who were great mentors and people who had more experience than I did. And gradually I built up my research portfolio and got to the point where I thought, I'm not sure what I want to do next, because I was both working in research in deafness, deaf children, services with deaf people, and I was doing research in social work. The two kind of never were coming together. They were like parallel streams in my academic life. And a job came up at the University of Manchester as the first professor of social work who had been, post was created after the merger of two universities into the university we have today. And I applied for it because it gave me the opportunity finally to put those two bits of my life into the same place. And so that's how I became a professor of social work.
That is so interesting, and it's interesting to see that there are two strands that I can see in there. Is that having the courage to ask for help from academics, so but also having the recognition of that curiosity all the way through, of knowing that you want to learn more, you want to find out new things, you want to research for the benefit of the people that you're working with, and those are two very clear strands for being practitioner and an academic, and it really does drive what we do, doesn't it? I can recognise that.
Totally. I mean, I can say hand on heart that no research project I've ever done hasn't come out of a problem that I have been aware of in practice. So sometimes I can give one example. It's taken me literally 20 years to get the money that I needed to research the thing that I might have first noticed all that time ago. But the fact that it makes a difference to people's lives, but also to how services are delivered, I think it's both things, has been a real motivation. But also somebody very wise said to me, who's got nothing to do with social work, but just very early on in my career, said, you know, Alys, just find your itch and scratch it. That's all you need to do.
That's really good advice, and we may come back to that on my third question. I'm aware that you're supporting one of our interns at the moment in ArcGM. Can you tell me a little bit of your experience of supporting an intern?
I think the first thing I'd say is it's astonishing to me in 2023 that these opportunities even exist for practicing social workers, and it's, you know, a huge credit to NIHR and the ARC that this notion of internships that apply to social work professionals has ever got off the ground, because these kinds of opportunities were always there for other professions. And it's funny, when I spoke to my intern at the welcome day, she said to me, I can't believe this is possible for us. And she meant social workers, because it's always health, 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 and social workers are kind of vaguely an attachment, or you used to have to pretend to be working in health in order to unlock some of those opportunities. And now the internships are for social work professionals in their own right to be developing as social workers in research, and that's just amazing. The other thing that she said to me, and there's two social work interns, I believe, at the moment, and the current pathway, is both of them sort of said, do you know, it's great not to be the only social worker in the room. because mostly social workers who are trying to develop themselves at that interface, so not only just in social work, but that interface with health, are generally speaking, you know, the odd one out who's somewhere at the back.
Mm-hmm.
So to have a program where interns are fully integrated and have each other and learn from other professions as well as from each other has just been amazing for her. And I think that's so valuable moving forward.
That's so so encouraging to hear, and it's one of the key ambitions of our programs within the ARC is to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible, broaden the reach, because that diversity increases the potential of us all to make a difference. When you were speaking about ultimately the example that you gave about knowing a problem and holding on to the solution of that problem for 20 years, we know that some of the problems that we have, that we're facing for our places and our people who in Greater Manchester are have difficult solutions, and some of the problems are really, no one person has the answer to that. And the more we can increase the diversity of the researchers who are trying to solve those problems, the better we all are. So it's really encouraging to hear that.
No, absolutely. And social work is a very proud profession. You know, we've had social work in some form or other for, you know, well over 100 years. Might not have had the label social work till the 1970s, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there before. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that social workers have consistently resisted is the idea that they are more or less the same as another profession, just called something different. And what's finally happening at this point, it was happening in the, you know, the end of the 20th century and moving into 21st century, is that there is a greater recognition of social work knowledge, social work skills, social work evidence, social work practice in its own right as its own expertise. Mm-hmm. And it's lovely having that recognised within a structure like the ARC that is finally sort of saying, look, you know, these are social workers, those are OTs over there, those are nurses over there. Mm-hmm. Social workers exist. They're not social care workers, they're social workers.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a really great reflection. And also, as you say, we're inspiring the next generation of our professions. And I recognise what you're saying also for my own profession in nursing, of recognising that expertise and valuing that expertise. It's there's a lot of things that unite us, but also it's equally important to recognise our individual expertise and how we add value to one another.
Yes.
So my final question is, if somebody was thinking about research or having a career that includes research as a social worker, what bits of advice would you give them?
That's a good question. The first bit of advice I think is true for everybody, not just social workers. Don't even start down that pathway unless you really want to do it. You have to be motivated, enthusiastic, interested, curious, all of those things to be a researcher. And if you're not sure that's where you want to go, then it's not worth doing it. But having said that, one of the things about the internships, so these are pre-doctoral, it's the opportunity to test out whether in fact that is where you want to go. And that's one of the things that I most admire about the internships. Even if you've just got that half idea that maybe it's for you, but you're not 100% sure, then my advice is try and get one of these internships, because that's your space to work that out for yourself. And if at the end of it, you know, you don't want to follow a research career pathway, that's absolutely fine, but you won't know unless you've tried it. The other piece of advice is, I suppose for social work research, I'd say do not get too far away from practice. So I think historically many researchers who were in social work, began their research career and then somehow morphed into sociologists or somehow morphed into social policy people. And somehow it was seen as cleverer or better if you were, you know, carrying out research that wasn't actually about the everyday lives and practice of social work. Thankfully, I think that's gone. So I'd say don't get too far away from what are the real challenges that people are facing, whether they're practitioners or service users and carers.
That's great advice. So to summarize your 3 key points there, in terms of how I've heard it, is be motivated. Don't do it unless you're motivated to be curious and that you've got problems that you want answers to and that you're passionate about. And you're right, I would be saying that to any professional, that you've really got to want to know the answer, or in your terms that you put earlier, and you've got an itch that you want to scratch, is that you've got to have that desire to get an answer to a question. So I completely agree with you there, but also seek out experiences, test out whether it's a career for you, and internships, you're absolutely right, are a really good place to start there. And it's great advice to stay connected to your profession and your professional roots and find ways, and as you say, that is so much more possible to do. So, you know, when I first came into nursing 30 years ago, and when I did my PhD, you really didn't have the option, if you wanted to nurture and feed your academic side, then you needed to move into an academic discipline. And maybe in social work that was a similar thing, that those of us who wanted to build and develop academically were faced with quite stark choices about where we ended up and where we found a home. And now the great thing about it is that those choices aren't so stark, and that it is possible to combine and stay connected with your professional practice base, as well as developing your academic skills. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your answers, and I'm sure that it will be an inspiration to those who are within social work and social workers today, as they're contemplating their profession and the impact they make in our world. So thank you very much, Alys.
Thanks very much.